There's a particular suffocating silence that falls over a courtroom the moment a man's life gets dismantled. It doesn't happen with a bang, but with a quiet, undeniable click as the trap snaps shut. Richard Thorpe, a man whose tailored suits cost more than most people's cars, had built his entire career on being the one holding the trap. He was a predator in a pinstripe suit, and in his eyes the man on the witness stand was nothing but easy prey. But arrogance is a blinding disease. What Richard did not know as he smirked at the jury, mercilessly mocking the black mechanic sitting before him, was that he was not the predator today. He was the bait, and his public execution had already begun. The air inside courtroom 302 of the Cook County Courthouse was aggressively cold, a stark contrast to the sweltering summer heat radiating off the Chicago pavement outside. To Richard Thorpe, the chill was invigorating. It smelled of lemon floor polish, old leather, and fear. Mostly it smelled of his own impending victory. Richard sat at the defense table, lazily spinning a silver Mont Blanc pen between his impeccably manicured fingers. He was a senior partner at Thorpe, Langston and Croft, a law firm that specialized in making the catastrophic mistakes of billionaires disappear. He possessed a head of thick silver fox hair, a jawline that belonged on a bronze bust, and a complete sociopathic absence of empathy. Beside him sat his client, Vincent Bowman. Bowman was a real estate titan whose latest crown jewel, the Southside Logistics Center, had spectacularly collapsed, crushing millions of dollars in inventory and, more problematically for Richard's bottom line, severely injuring 4 overnight workers. The lawsuit was a multi-million-dollar gross negligence nightmare. The prosecution claimed Bowman Industries had cut corners, ignored structural warnings, and used subpar steel to meet a fast-approaching deadline. Richard's job was simple: prove the collapse was an unforeseeable act of God and completely destroy anyone who claimed otherwise. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's attorney, Rachel Donovan, was organizing her files. Rachel was sharp, relentless, and exhausted. She lacked Richard's theatrical flair, relying instead on a stubborn adherence to the facts. But in Richard's world, facts were just clay waiting to be molded by a superior storyteller. "The plaintiff calls Mr. Jerome Ellis to the stand," Rachel announced, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. Richard stopped spinning his pen. He leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting a field mouse. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Jerome Ellis walked down the center aisle. He was a tall, broad-shouldered black man. He wore a neat but noticeably worn navy blue button-down shirt, khaki slacks that had seen better days, and a pair of scuffed steel-toed boots that squeaked faintly against the marble floor. He held a small weathered leather notebook tightly in his left hand, his knuckles slightly ashen from the grip. Richard leaned over to Bowman, shielding his mouth with a file folder. "Look at this guy," Richard whispered, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Donovan must be desperate. She's dragging in the neighborhood oil changer to testify about industrial engineering." Bowman snickered softly, his tension easing. "Wipe the floor with him, Rich. I'm going to have him apologizing for being in the same room as us by the time I'm done." Richard replied, his voice a smooth, venomous purr. Jerome stepped into the witness box and raised his right hand, swearing to tell the truth. He sat down, looking visibly uncomfortable. He adjusted the microphone, the feedback whining briefly in the large room. He looked at the jury, then at Rachel Donovan, and finally his eyes landed on Richard Thorpe. For a split second there was no fear in Jerome's eyes, only a quiet, heavy stillness. But Richard, blinded by his own prejudice and ego, only saw a blue-collar worker out of his depth. Rachel approached the podium. "Mr. Ellis, can you please state your full name and current occupation for the record?" "Jerome Ellis," he replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. "Right now I'm the head mechanic at West Side Auto Diagnostics." Richard made a great show of writing the word mechanic on his legal pad, underlining it 3 times so the jury box situated just a few feet away could see his theatrical dismissal. Rachel continued, "Mr. Ellis, on the night of the incident, you were present at the Southside Logistics Center, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. I was contracted by one of the overnight distribution companies to fix a fleet of delivery trucks parked in the loading bay basement." "And while you were in the basement, did you observe anything unusual regarding the building itself?" Jerome nodded slowly. "I did. Late that night, I started hearing a distinct rhythmic groaning coming from the main support pillars. It wasn't normal settling. It was a high-frequency stress sound, like metal shearing under load it wasn't meant to hold. I saw hairline fractures spreading across the concrete base of Pillar 4B. I tried to tell the site manager, but he told me to mind my own business." "And what happened shortly after, Mr. Ellis?" "The roof caved in. The eastern quadrant collapsed," Jerome said quietly. Rachel walked the jury through Jerome's testimony, painting a picture of a man who had heard the warning signs that Bowman's company had allegedly ignored. It was a solid, direct examination. Jerome came across as honest, earnest, and observant, but Richard was not worried. Being honest in a courtroom was a disadvantage if the opposing counsel knew how to make you look stupid. And Richard Thorpe was a master of making people look stupid. "Thank you, Mr. Ellis," Rachel said, returning to her seat. "Your witness." Richard stood up slowly. He did not rush. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate, agonizing slowness, letting the silence stretch until the entire courtroom was focused entirely on him. He picked up a single sheet of paper and walked toward the center of the room, stopping exactly in the middle to ensure he was the focal point of everyone's attention. The blood sport was about to begin. "Mr. Ellis," Richard began, his voice dripping with practiced saccharine politeness. "Or do you prefer Chief Mechanic?" "Mr. Ellis is fine," Jerome replied evenly. "Excellent," Richard said, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "Now, Mr. Ellis, I want to make sure I understand your testimony clearly. You're currently employed at, let me check my notes here." Richard lifted the paper, squinting at it as if reading a foreign language. "Westside Auto Diagnostics, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "You change oil. You rotate tires. You plug in computers to tell folks why their check engine light is blinking. A noble profession. Truly the backbone of the American commute." Richard's tone was so heavily laden with sarcasm it practically dripped onto the floor. "I run diagnostic analytics on heavy machinery and automotive systems," Jerome corrected mildly. Right, you fix cars," Richard dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Now, Mr. Ellis, tell me, how many years of architectural engineering did you study at Westside Auto?" "Objection," Rachel Donovan snapped, half standing. "Relevance. The witness is testifying to what he heard and saw, not as an expert architectural witness." "Overruled," Judge Caldwell said, adjusting his glasses. "I'll allow a little leeway, Mr. Thorpe, but get to the point." "The point, Your Honor, is the witness's credibility to interpret what he saw," Richard said smoothly, turning back to Jerome. "Mr. Ellis, my client's building was a state-of-the-art logistics hub designed by top-tier engineers. Yet you, a man who spends his days covered in grease under a Honda Civic, claim you were able to accurately diagnose a catastrophic structural failure just by listening to it." Jerome gripped the notebook in his lap. "I know what metal sounds like when it's failing." Sir." Richard let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He turned entirely to the jury, throwing his arms wide. "He knows what metal sounds like. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll stop the presses. Why do we bother with structural stress tests and metallurgical analysis when we can just hire Mr. Ellis to press his ear against a wall? A few jurors chuckled. The older ones smiled. Richard was playing them like a fiddle. He was tapping into a societal bias, relying on the visual contrast between his expensive Italian suit and Jerome's faded workwear, between his refined, rapid-fire vocabulary and Jerome's measured, unpretentious speech. "Mr. Thorpe," Judge Caldwell warned, though there was no real heat in his voice. "Apologies, Your Honor," Richard said, turning back to Jerome with a shark-like grin. "Let's talk about these groans you heard, Mr. Ellis. You said it sounded like high-frequency stress. Are you sure it wasn't just a heavy truck driving by? Or perhaps the building's HVAC system kicking on? Buildings make noises, Mr. Ellis. They aren't dead things." "It was structural shearing," Jerome insisted, his voice remaining remarkably calm despite the barrage. "The resonance was completely wrong for an HVAC unit. The micro-fractures on Pillar 4B corroborated the acoustic stress." Richard stopped pacing. He leaned heavily on the podium, staring Jerome down. "Micro-fractures, acoustic stress. My, Mr. Ellis, you've certainly learned some fancy vocabulary words from watching the Discovery Channel." Rachel slammed her hand on the table. "Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness and making disparaging remarks." Sustained. "Mr. Thorpe, dial it back," the judge ordered. "Let me rephrase," Richard said, his eyes never leaving Jerome's. He wanted to break the man. He wanted Jerome angry, flustered and hostile. A hostile black man on the stand was exactly the stereotype Richard needed to win over the more conservative members of the jury. "Mr. Ellis, isn't it true you're just looking for a payout? You were in a scary situation. You got some dust on your boots. And now you and Miss Donovan are trying to play armchair engineer to extort my client. No, sir. I'm here to tell you why the roof fell on those people." Richard scoffed aggressively. "You don't know why it fell. You are a mechanic. You don't have the education, the background, or the intellect to understand the complex load-bearing schematics of a Class A commercial superstructure. You heard a squeak, panicked, and now you're pretending to be an expert." Richard took a few steps closer to the witness stand, invading Jerome's space. He pointed a manicured finger directly at Jerome's chest. "You are completely unqualified to be sitting in that chair, Mr. Ellis. You're a grease monkey playing pretend in a room full of adults. Isn't that right?" The courtroom held its breath. Rachel was on her feet shouting an objection. Vincent Bowman was grinning from ear to ear. Richard stood there victorious, practically glowing with smug satisfaction. He had humiliated the man. He had destroyed the testimony. But as Richard waited for Jerome to crack, to yell, or to shrink into himself, something strange happened. Jerome did not look angry. He did not look humiliated. Jerome looked at Richard with an expression of profound, almost sorrowful pity. "Are you finished, Mr. Thorpe?" Jerome asked, his voice cutting through the ringing silence of the room. It was not loud, but the absolute lack of intimidation in his tone made Richard's stomach give a microscopic twitch. "I'll ask the questions here, Mr. Ellis," Richard snapped, suddenly feeling a loss of control he could not quite identify. "I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor." Richard spun on his heel, his coat flaring behind him, and marched back to his desk. He sat down, shooting a triumphant look at Bowman. "Done," he whispered. But behind him, Jerome Ellis uncrossed his legs and slowly opened the weathered leather notebook he had been clutching. The blood sport was not over. The prey had just locked the cage from the inside. "Redirect, Miss Donovan," Judge Caldwell asked, looking down at his docket. Rachel Donovan stood up. She did not look defeated. In fact, if Richard had been paying closer attention to his opposing counsel, rather than basking in his own perceived glory, he would have noticed the dangerous, razor-thin smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. "Yes, Your Honor. I have just a few follow-up questions for Mr. Ellis." Rachel walked slowly toward the witness stand. The dynamic in the room had subtly shifted. The oppressive heat of Richard's cross-examination had dissipated, replaced by a strange, anticipatory vacuum. "Mr. Ellis," Rachel began, her voice calm and conversational, "opposing counsel made quite a spectacle regarding your current employment. He spent a significant amount of time focusing on the fact that you work as a mechanic at Westside Auto Diagnostics." "Objection," Richard called out from his seat, not even bothering to stand. "Mischaracterization of counsel's conduct. Overruled. Let's move this along, Miss Donovan." The judge sighed. "Mr. Ellis," Rachel continued, stepping closer to the jury box. "Counsel was correct, wasn't he? You do currently work at that auto shop." "Yes, ma'am. It is honest work. It pays the bills, keeps a roof over my head." "But Mr. Ellis," Rachel paused, letting the silence hang. "Opposing counsel, in his rush to judge your intellect based on your work boots, forgot to ask you a very important question." Richard scoffed audibly from the defense table. Bowman leaned over. "What is she doing?" he whispered. "Flailing?" Richard whispered back, trying to salvage his dignity. Rachel turned so she was facing both Jerome and Richard. "Mr. Ellis, why did you start working at the auto shop?" Jerome looked up. His eyes locked directly onto Richard Thorpe. The air in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Because I resigned from my previous position," Jerome said. "And what was that previous position?" "I was the Senior Quality Assurance Inspector for the Illinois Department of Commercial Architecture," Jerome stated. His baritone voice was perfectly clear, echoing off the mahogany walls. A dead, breathless silence hit the courtroom, the kind of silence that precedes a shockwave. Richard Thorpe stopped breathing, his hands still holding the silver Mont Blanc pen frozen midair. He blinked once hard. Several jurors suddenly sat up perfectly straight. The older woman in the front row, who had chuckled at Richard's jokes earlier, dropped her pen. "Senior Quality Assurance Inspector," Rachel repeated, savoring every syllable. "And prior to your time at the State Department, what was your educational background, Mr. Ellis?" Jerome looked at the jury. "I hold a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a master's degree in structural metallurgy from Stanford University." The courtroom erupted into a low murmur of shock. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. MIT, Stanford. Structural metallurgy. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. He frantically grabbed his iPad, his perfectly manicured fingers slipping on the glass screen as he furiously typed Jerome's name into his firm's background check database. How had his associates missed this? How had he missed this? "Your Honor!" Richard shouted, leaping to his feet. "Objection. This is an ambush. Plaintiff's counsel is introducing expert testimony credentials without prior disclosure." Rachel turned to him, her smile now fully realized and completely lethal. "Your Honor, Mr. Ellis is not here as an expert witness for the prosecution. He is a fact witness. He is testifying to what he observed. It was Mr. Thorpe who made his education and qualifications an issue during his cross-examination. He opened the door. I am merely allowing the witness to walk through it." Judge Caldwell stared at Richard, his eyebrows raised so high they nearly met his hairline. The judge looked at the flustered, suddenly pale defense attorney, and then down at the calm, resolute man on the stand. "She's right, Mr. Thorpe," the judge said, a hint of grim satisfaction in his voice. "You spent minutes aggressively questioning this man's intellectual capacity and background. You practically kicked the door off its hinges. Objection overruled. Proceed, Miss Donovan." Richard slowly sank back into his chair. For the first time in his career, he felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine. Bowman was staring at him, his face flushed purple with sudden rage. "You told me he was a nobody," Bowman hissed through his teeth. "Shut up," Richard hissed back, his eyes glued to Jerome. "Mr. Ellis," Rachel continued. The tension in the room was now thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. "If you held such a prestigious and highly compensated position with the state, why did you resign to become a mechanic?" Jerome looked down at the weathered leather notebook in his lap. He ran a rough hand over the cover. "I was assigned to do the preliminary permit inspections for a new mega project in the South Side. The South Side Logistics Center." Richard's stomach dropped out completely. It was as if the floor of the courtroom had vanished. "I conducted an audit of the architectural blueprints and the proposed material supply chain," Jerome continued, opening the notebook and turning to a page filled with dense, meticulously drawn engineering schematics and mathematical equations. "I found critical flaws. The structural load limits on the blueprints did not match the tensile strength of the steel being ordered by the developer. It was a discrepancy of nearly 30%. "What did you do with this information, Mr. Ellis?" Rachel asked quietly. "I filed a red flag report with my superiors. I refused to sign off on the permits. I stated on the record that if the building was constructed using those materials, a catastrophic shearing event was mathematically inevitable once the building bore a full commercial load." "And what happened after you filed that report?" Jerome looked directly at Vincent Bowman. The billionaire shrank back slightly under the heavy gaze. "A few days later, I was called into the director's office," Jerome said. "I was told my math was wrong. I was told I was obstructing economic development. When I refused to back down, my desk was cleared out. I was blacklisted from every major engineering firm in the tri-state area. I was driven out of my profession entirely. So I took a job fixing cars because my math wasn't wrong. And I couldn't stomach working in an industry that prioritized a ribbon-cutting ceremony over human lives." The jury box was completely locked onto Jerome. They were not just listening anymore. They were captivated. The smug narrative Richard had spent the last hour building had just been incinerated. "Mr. Ellis," Rachel said, pointing to the notebook, "what is in that book you're holding?" "This," Jerome said, lifting the book slightly, "is my personal log from the time. It contains my original equations, my metallurgical stress projections, and the exact timestamps of the meetings I had with the developers. And when you were working in the basement of that building on the night of the incident and you heard that groaning sound, did you need a computer to tell you what it was?" "No, ma'am," Jerome said, his eyes locking back on Richard Thorpe, holding the lawyer in a stare of absolute unyielding authority. "I knew exactly what it was. It was the exact sound I told them the building would make right before it killed someone." Richard Thorpe sat frozen. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had broken his legs. And the worst part was he knew Rachel Donovan was not done yet. The silence in courtroom 302 was no longer just quiet. It was suffocating. It was the kind of heavy, expectant hush that follows a lightning strike right before the thunder rattles your teeth. Richard Thorpe stared at the weathered leather notebook in Jerome Ellis's hands as if it were a live grenade. His mind, usually a high-speed processor of legal loopholes and manipulative rhetoric, was completely blank. He had spent his entire morning painting this man as an uneducated laborer, a grease monkey reaching above his station. Instead, he had just spent an hour mocking a man with degrees from MIT and Stanford, a former senior quality assurance inspector who possessed the exact structural math, proving Richard's client was entirely responsible for the collapse. "Your Honor," Richard finally choked out, his voice losing its polished theatrical resonance. I must vehemently object. This notebook is hearsay. It has not been authenticated. It was not disclosed in discovery as an expert report. Rachel Donovan leaned casually against the plaintiff's table, a picture of absolute serenity. Your Honor, as I stated, Mr. Ellis is not testifying as an expert witness. He is testifying as a fact witness. He is stating for the record what he did. The notebook is a contemporaneous record of his daily work activities at the time. It is perfectly admissible under the business records exception. And furthermore, it goes directly to the timeline of the defendant's knowledge of the structural defects. Judge Caldwell peered over his reading glasses, first at Richard, then at the notebook. Miss Donovan, did the defense have access to the personnel files of the Illinois Department of Commercial Architecture during discovery? They did, Your Honor, Rachel replied smoothly. In fact, we subpoenaed the communication logs between Bowman Industries and the department. If Mr. Thorpe's associates had bothered to cross-reference the name of the man who signed off on the red flag report with the name of the mechanic they deposed, they would have found it. They didn't look, Your Honor, because they didn't care. Richard felt a hot, prickling sensation crawl up the back of his neck. He turned slowly to look at his junior partner, Ryan Brentwood, who was sitting in the gallery directly behind the defense table. Ryan's face was the color of spoiled milk. He was furiously swiping at his tablet, visibly shaking. They had missed it. They had entirely dismissed Jerome Ellis as a blue-collar casualty and had not run a deep background check. Arrogance had blinded them. Objection overruled, Judge Caldwell declared, his gavel hitting the sounding block with a sharp crack. The notebook is admitted into evidence as Plaintiff's Exhibit 42. You may proceed, Miss Donovan. Thank you, Your Honor, Rachel said. She walked toward the witness box. Mr. Ellis, let's talk about those equations in your notebook in plain English so we can all understand. What did your math prove about the Southside Logistics Center Tenier? Jerome opened the notebook, the pages crinkling softly. He did not look at Richard anymore. He looked directly at the jury. The blueprints called for high-yield structural steel. Grade 65, Jerome explained, his voice calm, authoritative, and utterly devoid of the arrogance Richard possessed. Grade 65 is expensive. It's designed to hold massive shifting loads like heavy machinery and multi-ton delivery trucks. But when I audited the supply invoices from Kensington Steelworks, the supplier Mr. Bowman contracted, I noticed they weren't shipping grade 65. They were shipping grade 36. That is standard carbon steel. It's cheaper, and it is incredibly brittle under high-frequency stress. And what happens when you build a commercial distribution center with brittle steel, Mr. Ellis? Rachel asked. You create a time bomb, Jerome said flatly. The math is undeniable. Stress equals force divided by a cross-sectional area. The force of the delivery trucks driving over the foundation created a rhythmic vibration because the steel was too weak to absorb and distribute the kinetic energy. The stress concentrated at the anchoring points, specifically Pillar 4B. The steel didn't just bend, it sheared, like snapping a dry twig. One of the jurors, a retired schoolteacher, was taking frantic notes. Another, a middle-aged man in a flannel shirt, was glaring openly at Vincent Bowman. Mr. Ellis, Rachel continued, her voice rising slightly to command the room. You testified earlier that you filed a report about this exact issue. Who did you give that report to? I handed it directly to Commissioner Daniel Voss, Jerome said. A collective gasp echoed from the press gallery at the back of the room. Commissioner Daniel Voss was the city commissioner of zoning and urban development. He was a notoriously powerful, untouchable political figure in Chicago, and a known frequent golf partner of Vincent Bowman. And what did Commissioner Voss say to you when you handed him the proof that Bowman Industries was using substandard steel? Jerome's jaw tightened. He told me that Vincent Bowman was a very important man who was bringing jobs to the city. He told me that my calculations were overly conservative. When I told him the building would inevitably collapse, he took my report, put it through his paper shredder, and told me I was fired. "Objection!" Richard roared, jumping up so fast his chair tipped backward and clattered loudly against the floor. "This is outrageous. Counsel is using this witness to hurl unfounded defamatory accusations at city officials who aren't even on trial here." "It goes to the core of the negligence claim, Your Honor," Rachel fired back, matching his volume. "The defense claimed this collapse was an act of God. We are proving it was an act of greed. Mr. Bowman knew the steel was weak, and he used his political connections to bury the man who tried to stop him." "Enough!" Judge Caldwell shouted, banging his gavel 3 times. "Both of you approach the bench now." Richard practically sprinted to the judge's bench, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Rachel joined him, completely composed. "Mr. Thorpe," Judge Caldwell whispered harshly, leaning over the high mahogany desk, "your client is in serious trouble and you are losing control of my courtroom. If this witness can prove Bowman and Voss colluded to suppress a safety report, this ceases to be a civil negligence trial and becomes a criminal conspiracy investigation." "He has no proof," Richard hissed, spit flying from his lips. "It's his word against the city commissioners. He said Voss shredded the report. It's a phantom document." Rachel Donovan smiled. It was not a smug smile like Richard's. It was the cold, clinical smile of a surgeon about to make the final incision. "Actually, Richard," Rachel whispered, "he does have proof." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, plaintiff requests a brief recess to retrieve a new piece of evidence from our secure server. It directly corroborates Mr. Ellis's testimony." Judge Caldwell looked at Richard's pale, sweat-beaded face, then nodded. "Granted. We are in recess. Mr. Thorpe, I suggest you advise your client on the severity of perjury." The men's restroom adjacent to courtroom 302 was lined in cold white marble. Richard Thorpe stood gripping the edge of the porcelain sink, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He looked older than he had that morning. His silver hair was disheveled, his expensive tie loosened. He splashed cold water on his face, but it did nothing to cool the burning panic in his chest. The door banged open. Vincent Bowman stormed in, followed closely by a terrified-looking Ryan Brentwood. Bowman's face was twisted in a snarl of pure, unfiltered rage. "What the hell is happening out there, Rich?" Bowman screamed, his voice echoing sharply off the tiles. "You told me this was a slam dunk. You told me this guy was an idiot mechanic looking for a quick settlement. Keep your voice down," Richard snapped, grabbing a paper towel and aggressively drying his face. "We missed his background. It happens. It's a blind spot." "A blind spot!" Bowman shoved Ryan Brentwood aside and got right in Richard's face. "He's a former state inspector with degrees from MIT. He has a notebook full of math proving I skimped on the steel. That's not a blind spot, Richard. That's a nuclear bomb." Richard took a deep breath, trying to summon his usual manipulative charm. "Vincent, listen to me. It's his word against Commissioner Voss's. Voss shredded the report. There is no physical copy of that report in the state archives. I checked myself before the trial began. We can spin this. We paint Ellis as a disgruntled, fired employee with a vendetta, making up a conspiracy theory." Ryan Brentwood cleared his throat. He was practically vibrating with anxiety. "Richard, not now, Ryan. Richard, you need to look at this," Ryan insisted, his voice cracking. He held out his tablet, his hand shaking violently. Richard snatched the tablet. He looked at the screen. It was an email thread pulled from the firm's internal archive. Richard's blood ran completely cold. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, from Vincent Bowman to Richard Thorpe. Subject, urgent. State inspector issue. Rich, Daniel just called me. We have a problem. Some hotshot inspector named Jerome Ellis is holding up the permits for the South Side project. He's whining about the steel grade from Kensington. He ran some numbers and is refusing to sign off. If we have to reorder grade 65 steel, it delays the project and costs me an extra $4 million. I told Daniel to handle the kid on his end, but I need your firm to draft an aggressive NDA and a severance package to make sure Ellis never talks about this. Bury him. From Richard Thorpe to Vincent Bowman. Subject, urgent state inspector issue. Relax, Vince. Consider it handled. I'll have Ryan draft a watertight non-disclosure agreement disguised as a standard severance release. If he refuses to sign, we'll threaten him with a defamation suit that will tie him up in litigation until he goes bankrupt. He's just a state worker. He doesn't have the funds to fight us. The project stays on the schedule. Richard dropped the tablet. It hit the marble floor with a loud crack, the screen splintering into a spiderweb of broken glass. Vincent Bowman asked, his rage suddenly replaced by a creeping dread. "What was that?" Richard could not speak. He could not breathe. He remembered the email now. It had been just another minor inconvenience to crush for a wealthy client. He had not even looked at the name Jerome Ellis when he forwarded the request to his junior partner. To Richard, people like Jerome were not human beings. They were obstacles. Rachel said she subpoenaed the communication logs, Richard whispered, his voice hollow. Not just yours, Vincent. Ours. What does that mean? Bowman demanded, grabbing Richard by the lapels of his suit. It means, Richard said, staring blankly at the wall, that we didn't just hide the defect. We orchestrated the cover-up, and it's in writing. The bailiff stuck his head into the restroom. Gentlemen, the judge is ready for you. Walking back into the courtroom felt like walking to the gallows. Richard's legs felt like lead. As he sat down at the defense table, he did not look at the jury. He did not look at the judge. He looked across the aisle at Rachel Donovan. She was holding a single piece of paper. Court is back in session, Judge Caldwell announced. Miss Donovan, you stated you had corroborating evidence. I do, Your Honor, Rachel said. She did not swagger. She did not gloat. She simply walked to the center of the room with the lethal calm of inevitable justice. Your Honor, when Mr. Ellis was wrongfully terminated, he refused to sign the severance agreement presented to him because it contained a gag order. During discovery, we subpoenaed the origins of that gag order. Rachel turned to look at Richard Thorpe, the man who had mocked a witness's intelligence, who had ridiculed his boots and his job, was now visibly shrinking into his expensive chair. I would like to submit Plaintiff's Exhibit 43, Rachel declared, her voice ringing clear and true. An email exchange between the defendant, Vincent Bowman, and his chief counsel, Richard Thorpe. A heavy collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Richard closed his eyes. In this email, Rachel continued, reading from the page, Mr. Bowman explicitly admits that Inspector Jerome Ellis found critical flaws with the steel from Kensington Works. He admits that fixing it would cost him $4 million, and he explicitly orders his attorney, Mr. Thorpe, to bury him to keep the project on schedule. Rachel walked over to the witness stand and handed the paper to Jerome. Jerome took it. He read it quietly. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Richard's. Mr. Ellis, Rachel asked softly, is this why you couldn't find work in your field? Yes, ma'am, Jerome said. Mr. Thorpe's firm sent letters to every engineering firm in Chicago, threatening them with tortious interference lawsuits if they hired me. They destroyed my career to save $4 million. And because of it, 4 men are in the hospital and the Southside Logistics Center is a pile of rubble. Judge Caldwell took off his glasses. He looked at Vincent Bowman, who was hiding his face behind his hands. Then he looked at Richard Thorpe. The judge's face was a mask of absolute, unadulterated disgust. "Mr. Thorpe," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly quiet, "you have exactly 5 seconds to explain to me why I shouldn't have you and your client arrested for criminal fraud, subornation of perjury, and reckless endangerment right this very second." Richard stood up, his knees wobbling. He opened his mouth, but his silver tongue, the weapon he had used to destroy so many lives, was completely paralyzed. He had built his entire career on being the smartest man in the room, but as he looked at Jerome Ellis, the mechanic, the engineer, the man who had warned them all, Richard Thorpe finally realized the brutal truth. He was the stupidest man in the room, and his career was over. The silence in courtroom 302 was no longer just heavy. It was practically radioactive. Judge Caldwell's demand hung in the air, a guillotine blade waiting for the final fatal release. Richard Thorpe, a man who had spent his career weaving webs of legal invincibility, was utterly trapped in one of his own making. "Your Honor," Richard stammered, his voice a raspy, pathetic shadow of its former booming glory. This is a blatant violation of attorney-client privilege. Those communications are protected. Plaintiff's counsel has illegally acquired—" "Save it, Mr. Thorpe!" Judge Caldwell roared, his face flushing crimson. The judge slammed his hands down on his desk, leaning over the bench like a gargoyle. "Do not dare stand in my courtroom and invoke privilege to shield a felony. The crime-fraud exception invalidates any attorney-client privilege. The second you use your legal license to facilitate a cover-up. You did not give legal advice. You orchestrated the suppression of a safety warning that led to the severe injury of 4 human beings." Vincent Bowman, sitting at the defense table, was hyperventilating. His billionaire composure had completely shattered. The realization that his money could not buy his way out of a paper trail of his own creation was violently breaking his psyche. He looked at the jury, 12 ordinary citizens who were staring at him with undisguised revulsion. He looked at the gallery where reporters were already feverishly typing on their phones. The headline of his destruction already being beamed across Chicago. Then Bowman did what selfish men always do when the ship begins to sink. He looked for a body to throw overboard. Bowman shot out of his chair, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at his own lawyer. "He told me to do it!" Bowman screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "I didn't know the law. Richard told me if we just paid the kid off and got him fired, it would all go away. He drafted the letters. He made the threats. I relied on counsel, Your Honor." Richard whipped his head around, staring at his client in absolute horror. "Vincent, shut your mouth," Richard hissed, lunging forward to grab Bowman's arm. "Don't touch me," Bowman yelled, shoving Richard backward. Richard stumbled, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping on the polished floor, and he crashed hard into the mahogany table, sending his files and his silver Mont Blanc pen clattering to the ground. "He's the lawyer. He said the steel wouldn't fail. He said the state inspector was just trying to extort us." The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Spectators were shouting. The jury was leaning over the railing, wide-eyed. Flashbulbs from the corridor outside began popping wildly through the glass windows of the courtroom doors. "Order! Order in this court!" Judge Caldwell bellowed, hammering his gavel so hard the wooden handle splintered. "Bailiff, restrain the defendant. Nobody moves." 2 heavily armed court bailiffs rushed forward, placing themselves physically between Richard Thorpe and Vincent Bowman. Richard pulled himself up, clutching his ribs. His immaculate silver hair was now wildly disheveled. He looked across the room at Jerome Ellis. Jerome was still sitting in the witness box. He had not flinched. He had not yelled. He just sat there with that same calm expression, watching the two powerful men who had destroyed his life tear each other apart like cornered rats. Rachel Donovan stood quietly beside the podium, her arms crossed, watching the implosion with grim satisfaction. She did not need to ask another question. The defense had just cross-examined itself into a prison sentence. "Miss Donovan," Judge Caldwell said, his breathing heavy, his eyes locked onto Richard. "Are there any further questions for this witness?" "No, Your Honor," Rachel said softly. "I believe the witness has illuminated the truth." "I agree," the judge said. He turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are dismissed for the day. Do not speak to the press." As the jury filed out, casting parting glares at the defense table, Judge Caldwell turned his wrath back to Richard and Bowman. "I am declaring a mistrial in this civil proceeding," Judge Caldwell announced, his voice echoing like thunder. "The scope of what has been revealed today far exceeds civil negligence. I am ordering the immediate impounding of all defense files in this room. Furthermore, I am directly referring this transcript, Exhibit 42 and Exhibit 43, to the District Attorney's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Richard felt his knees give out. He slumped into his chair, staring blankly at the floor. The pen he had been spinning so arrogantly just moments ago lay near his foot, cracked and leaking black ink onto the pristine marble. "Mr. Thorpe, Mr. Bowman," the judge finalized, his tone dripping with absolute disdain, "I highly suggest you both find yourselves new legal representation, because neither of you will be leaving this courthouse without speaking to a federal prosecutor. We are adjourned." The fallout was a seismic event that shook the foundations of Chicago's elite. When the dam broke, it washed away everything Richard Thorpe had built. The district attorney, an aggressive prosecutor named Nathan Hughes, did not hesitate. Heavily armed FBI agents raided the offices of Bowman Industries and the law firm of Thorpe, Langston, and Croft. They carried out dozens of boxes of hard drives, emails, and internal memos. Richard's partners, the very men he had shared expensive scotch and cigars with for years, abandoned him immediately. To save their own legal licenses and the firm's reputation, they completely cooperated with the feds, waiving all privilege and handing over every shred of evidence proving Richard had personally orchestrated the intimidation and blacklisting of Jerome Ellis. Ryan Brentwood, the junior associate, testified against Richard in exchange for full immunity. Karma, when it finally arrives, does not knock politely. It kicks the door off the hinges. The criminal trial concluded. Vincent Bowman was found guilty of massive corporate fraud, bribery, and 4 counts of reckless endangerment. He was sentenced to a lengthy term in federal prison. Commissioner Daniel Voss, the corrupt city commissioner who had shredded Jerome's initial warning, was indicted on federal racketeering charges and sentenced to prison. But it was Richard Thorpe's fall that was the most spectacular. The Illinois State Bar Association stripped him of his license in a humiliating public disciplinary hearing. His wife filed for divorce, freezing his remaining personal assets. Facing a mountain of incontrovertible documentary evidence and the damning testimony of his own former client, Richard was forced to plead guilty to subornation of perjury, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The man who had mocked a mechanic's intelligence stood before a federal judge wearing a cheap, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit and was sentenced to prison. As for Jerome Ellis, the universe finally balanced the scales. The civil lawsuit against Bowman Industries was settled by the company's insurers for a staggering sum. The 4 injured workers received lifelong medical care and financial security, Jerome, as the whistleblower whose career was maliciously destroyed, filed a separate defamation and wrongful termination suit. He was awarded a substantial amount. The governor of Illinois personally called Jerome to apologize on behalf of the state, offering him the position of chief director of commercial architecture. Jerome respectfully declined. Instead, he took his settlement money and opened his own firm, Ellis Structural Integrity and Auditing. He hired the best, most uncompromised engineers in the country. Within a few years, Ellis Structural became the gold standard for safety inspections in the Midwest. No major commercial project in Chicago could secure financing without an Ellis stamp of approval. Richard Thorpe was granted early parole for nonviolent behavior. He was broke, disbarred, and a convicted felon. The high society country clubs would not let him pass the security gate. No law firm would hire him to carry a briefcase, let alone practice. Desperate to meet the conditions of his parole, Richard took the only job willing to hire a disgraced, high-profile, white-collar criminal. It was a blistering afternoon. Richard, wearing a faded gray uniform with his name stitched on the breast pocket, was pushing a heavy industrial mop bucket across the lobby floor of a newly constructed state-of-the-art commercial high-rise in downtown Chicago. His back ached. His silver hair had thinned and turned brittle. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the men in expensive tailored suits walking past him. "Excuse me," a deep, resonant baritone voice called out. Richard stopped his mop. He looked up. Standing in the lobby, surrounded by a team of young, eager architects and developers hanging on his every word, was Jerome Ellis. Jerome was dressed in a sharp, immaculate charcoal suit, holding a silver tablet. He looked authoritative, respected, and completely in his element. Jerome's eyes flicked over to the janitor. He stopped. The group of developers stopped with him. For a long, agonizing moment, the two men just looked at each other. Richard's hands gripped the wooden handle of his mop so tightly his knuckles turned white. He felt a hot, suffocating wave of shame wash over him. He was the grease monkey now. He was the man in the dirty uniform, invisible to the world, cleaning up other people's messes. Jerome did not smirk. He did not mock him. He did not gloat. Just like in the courtroom years earlier, Jerome simply looked at him with a profound, quiet understanding of the universe's ultimate justice. Jerome gave a slow, single nod of acknowledgement. "Careful with the floor, gentlemen," Jerome said smoothly, turning back to his team of developers. "It's freshly mopped. Let's head up to the roof to check those load-bearing anchors." As Jerome and his team walked toward the private elevators, Richard stood alone in the massive, gleaming lobby. He looked over at a brass plaque bolted to the marble wall near the entrance. It gleamed under the overhead lights. Primary structural inspection and safety certification performed by Ellis Structural Integrity. Richard Thorpe looked down at his dirty mop water, the reflection of his own ruined life staring back at him. He gripped the handle, lowered his head, and went back to work. Arrogance is a heavy armor, but truth is a relentless armor-piercing round. Richard Thorpe believed his expensive suits, his eloquent vocabulary, and his elite status made him untouchable. He mistook Jerome Ellis's quiet dignity for weakness, and his blue-collar uniform for a lack of intelligence. But in his rush to humiliate a man he deemed beneath him, Richard orchestrated his own spectacular demise. True power does not roar in a courtroom. It speaks softly from a worn leather notebook filled with undeniable facts. The universe always balances the scales and karma never misses its target. If this story of justice served gave you chills, or if you just love seeing bullies get what they deserve, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that good still wins in the end. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. In the end, the courtroom didn't just witness the fall of a powerful man. It revealed one of life's most profound truths. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone you think is beneath you. Richard Thorpe had spent decades cloaked in arrogance, convinced that expensive suits, sharp words, and elite status made him untouchable. He looked at Jerome Ellis and saw only a grease-stained mechanic, someone easy to mock and dismiss. What he failed to see was a brilliant mind, a man of unshakable integrity, and a soul armed with nothing more dangerous than the simple, honest truth. That moment when Jerome calmly opened his weathered notebook and turned the tables remains burned in my memory. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and devastatingly powerful. In that instant, the universe reminded us all that real power doesn't roar from a podium or hide behind money and connections. It lives in the patient hands of those who do the right thing, even when it costs them everything. It lives in the courage to speak truth when silence would be easier. And it lives in the quiet dignity that refuses to be broken, no matter how hard the world tries. This story isn't just about karma catching up to the arrogant. It's a heartfelt reminder that every person walking past you carries a story, a depth and a value you may never see. The janitor, the mechanic, the quiet colleague, any one of them might hold the wisdom or strength that changes everything. Treat people with kindness and respect, not because of what they do or how they look, but because you never truly know who you're standing in front of. If this tale of justice and quiet resilience touched your heart the way it touched mine, drop a comment below and tell me, what's one time in your life when someone you underestimated turned out to be far greater than you imagined? I read every single one, and if stories like this, raw, emotional, and packed with life lessons, move you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Share this with someone who needs to remember that good still wins, and that truth always finds its way into the light. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.